In this example, I want to go ahead and look at our Linux EC2 instance. So I've gone ahead and started our Linux EC2 instance, and I've copied this public DNS address. And what I want to do in this example is I want to, using this Linux instance, I want to install WordPress. So WordPress is an open source PHP-based platform, and I want to download it and install that Linux-based application. In order to do that, I need some prerequisite components. So I need Apache installed, which I have already installed on this instance. I need PHP installed, and I already have that on this instance. Additionally, I'm going to need MySQL installed, and then I'm going to need to download that WordPress software. So I want to walk you through that process of how do I get a WordPress instance up and running so that I can use that as my website and kind of go from there. So this example doesn't necessarily cover how to configure WordPress or anything like that, but it'll get it installed and running for us so that we can deal with that on our Linux instance. So first thing I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to connect to this instance. So I have the public DNS entry copied, and I'm going to skip over to my terminal window. And I want to use SSH to connect to that server. So I'm going to use SSH-I. I need my key file. So my key file is on my desktop, and that's my current working directory. So I have this MATC demo key. And then I'm going to use the username Ubuntu @ and then that public DNS address. Okay, so I'm connected. It tells me that kind of the system load and how many people are logged in and stuff like that. That's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and clear the console. And again, just to verify things are working, I have the firewall opened for that public DNS. So here's my Cloud for Developers HTML file. So there's an HTML file sitting on this web server that I can use. But what I want to do is I want to have WordPress installed so that my WordPress instance comes up when I hit this domain name. Okay, so again, back to my terminal window. And the first thing I have to do is I have to install MySQL. So I'm going to use sudo run as an administrator is that sudo command. apt-get is the package manager. So I'm saying go get me a package. And the package that I want is MySQL-server. Sudo apt-get install MySQL server. It tells me it's going to take up some additional disk space. Do I want to continue? Sure. So it's going to go ahead and download the packages required to get MySQL running. Okay, and as this is going, it's going to take a few seconds to get MySQL installed. I'm just going to let it run here and we'll see the progress. And now that it's there, one thing that I want to do is I want to be able to connect to MySQL. So I should be able to do that. So I'm just going to use MySQL-u, that's the username. And the username that's there by default is root, and then -p to indicate what the password is going to be, and by default there is no password for the root user. Okay, and it's telling me that it failed, so I'm not able to connect. I'm not sure why. I'm going to give it a shot with no password, so I'm just going to do MySQL-u root with no password, still telling me access is denied. Let's try this one more time. I'm going to try to connect to the database as a root user account. So this has changed in the latest version of Ubuntu. So in order to connect to MySQL, I'm going to use the sudo command, and I'm just connecting as the root user. And now it'll allow me to connect as the root user to my MySQL database. In order for me to install WordPress, WordPress is going to have a dependency of I need a MySQL database available for WordPress to connect to. So right now, if I issue the command show databases, it'll show system databases, but nothing that I can actually use. So what I want to do is I want to create a database for WordPress that I'm going to use on this installation. So I'm going to say create database cloud for developers. And now if I issue the command show databases, you'll see cloud for developers is there. I don't need any table schema or any tables or anything like that. All I need is that database, and it's available now. So what I'm going to eventually have is I'm going to ask WordPress to connect to that particular database. Okay, so I'm going to exit out of MySQL, and I think my dependencies are now, my prereq dependencies are all now satisfied for me to run WordPress. Okay, so I'm going to clear that. Okay, so WordPress is an open source software package, and where I'm going to get WordPress is if I just go out online and I do a search for WordPress. There's the WordPress.com and WordPress.org. So WordPress.com is a commercial product that they sell to host WordPress, so they do the hosting for you. WordPress.org is the free open source content management system that you can download, and that's what we want to install. So I'm going to go out to WordPress.org, and then there's a link to get WordPress, and I can download the latest version of WordPress. So you can see down in the left window, bottom left of my window, that the download is actually https://wordpress.org/latest.zip. I need to get that file. So I want that file on my Linux instance. And there's a couple of ways to do that, but the easiest way is just to go to my terminal and get that file. So I'm going to use a command called wget. And the wget command is essentially a download command saying download a specific file, and then I'm going to give it the web-based URL. So wordpress.org and then latest.zip. Okay, so I'm downloading it. And if I do my directory listing, you'll see right there that latest.zip, that file, now exists right here in my current working directory, which is home/Ubuntu. What I want to do is I want to unzip latest.zip. Okay, so unzip is not installed, so you can see that I can install it with sudo apt install. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, and now I'm going to hit the up arrow to go back to that unzip command. And if I do a directory listing now, you'll see that there's a WordPress folder. Okay, so life's good. I have that WordPress folder. What I need to do is that WordPress folder needs to be in my web server root directory. So if you remember when we installed Apache onto this EC2 instance, what ended up happening is Apache has a configuration file, and the Apache configuration file says all of our files that our web server is looking for, the web server root directory, is going to be var www html. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to move this WordPress directory into that var www directory. And I get that there's still an HTML folder that I'm ignoring. The way I want to handle it is I want to move WordPress over to the var www directory, and then I want to change the Apache configuration file to say that the root directory is actually my WordPress directory. Okay, so I'm going to move that directory, so sudo move mv WordPress to the var www folder. Okay, and now if I do a directory listing, you'll see WordPress is gone, and it got moved. So if I go to my var www directory, here's WordPress. Okay, there's my WordPress folder. And that's not very helpful right now because my web server's root directory is going to be looking at this HTML folder, but I want it to look at this WordPress directory. So I'm going to change my Apache configuration file to look at the WordPress folder as my root directory. And my Apache configuration file is going to be in the etc Apache 2 directory. So I'm changing my working directory to etc apache2. And if I do a directory listing there, there's the apache2.conf. I want to edit that file so that my web server root directory is actually the var www WordPress directory. So I'm going to open up that Apache2 configuration file, and I'm going to look for my web server root directory. Okay, so I'm just using the arrows to scroll down that file. I could also search. Okay, that would work too. But right here, you'll notice that here's a directory. Okay, and I'm just going to use this setup that I have here already. Actually, www is okay. I don't want that one. I'm actually looking for the var www html directory. And you'll notice I didn't find it, so I just kind of went through pretty quick. What I want to do is I want to search. So down here, there's this where is, that's the search. So I'm going to use Control W, and I'm searching for var www html. It tells me it's not found. That's interesting. So let me try that again. I'm just going to search for var www. And we found it once, and I'm not sure where it's showing me. Interesting. Oh, here it is. So I'm going to do a Control W again and search again. Here it is again. And one more time. And it tells me that it didn't find it, so let me look elsewhere. So I'm going to go into the nvars and in here, I'm wondering if we'll have that var www directory. Oh, it tells me the user account. Okay, so the Apache configuration file changes kind of, depending on which version of Apache we're running and which Linux version that we're running. So under sites available, that's the directory, there's a couple of files, a couple of configuration files. So I'm just going to use nano to edit the default config file. And in here, you'll notice the document root is set to var www html. I'm just going to arrow over to that HTML section and change it to WordPress. And then I want to write it out, so I'm going to use Control O. And then it's saying, do you want to write it to this file name? Sure, I want to keep the existing file name. And then I'm going to exit out of the file. Okay, so now I'm going to have to restart Apache. So I'm going to do sudo service apache2 restart. And then the idea would be that I can take this public IP address and I should be able to access Apache, or I should be able to access my WordPress site. Okay, so I want to go back over to my EC2 instance. I'm going to copy this public DNS again. And I've now downloaded it. I now have it installed. And now if I run it, looks like I'm missing MySQL extension for PHP. So you'll notice that I'm in the WordPress folder in the setup config file, and it's telling me, hey, if you want to install WordPress, you're missing some of the prerequisite components. So I'm going to bounce back over to my terminal, and I'm going to do sudo apt-get install mysql-php. I think it might be php-mysql. Yep, I want to continue. Okay, so now it's installed. Now if I try to refresh this, still telling me it's missing that MySQL extension. I think I might have to restart Apache again. So I'll go ahead and restart Apache. And now it tells me, hey, we're ready to go to install this WordPress instance. Okay, so in order to do that, let's go. Okay, so we have a database. We called it Cloud for Developers. And again, where that came from is if we go back over to our server and we try to connect, so we do sudo mysql-u root, we're in, and we can show our databases. And we had set this up earlier. Okay, so Cloud for Developers, and it's going to be case sensitive, so we're using that. Our username is going to be root. We do not have a password. Our database host localhost is referring to the database on the local instance. Okay, now you really have to have a mental picture of this. So we have an EC2 instance. It's an AWS EC2 instance that's running Linux. That EC2 instance is running our WordPress instance. And on that same machine, we have MySQL. So when we're trying to connect to our MySQL instance, we're talking about the MySQL instance on the same server as where WordPress is installed. So relative to WordPress, MySQL's on localhost. Okay, and then our table prefix really doesn't matter, but traditionally WP underscore just stands for a WordPress table. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and submit this. Okay, it tells me that there's a problem creating the database connection. It either means the username and password were incorrect, okay, so we know that we should be able to connect, or the WP config file right now is not writable by our database or by our web server. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to set this up, and it's trying to write to our WP config file. I'll show you what we're talking about here. So I'm going to exit out of MySQL. I'm going to change my working directory over to WordPress. And in here, you'll notice that there's a WP config file, and it says that there's a WP config sample file. So what really happens is my web server tries to read that file, and it tries to change some configuration options. So I'll show you that file. And I need to open it with an editor, so I'm going to use Nano. And really what it is it basically says, what's your database, what's your username and password, and what's the host, and what's the prefix, and all of that stuff. So I need to change that for my specific installation. In order for that to happen, I need to basically give WordPress the permission to write to this directory. So we talked a little bit about Linux permissions in the past, and if we do ls-all, we can see the permissions. So right now, the root user account can read, write, and execute. The group can only read and execute, and then everyone else can read and execute. So only the owner, only Ubuntu, can write to those files, to that directory. So what I want to do is I want to change that so that we're going to change the group. So right now the web server is actually running with the user account www-data, and I would know that from my configuration files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the group. So the owner is Ubuntu, the group is also Ubuntu, and this doesn't make a ton of sense, but the way Linux works is there's a user account called Ubuntu, there's a group, which is a separate element called Ubuntu that only has that one user account in it. So essentially, the group and the owner are the same thing. I want to change that so that the owner is Ubuntu, but the group is associated with my web server account. So I'm going to change the group of WordPress to www-data. Invalid group WordPress. Sorry, it's the other way around. Change the group to www-data for the folder WordPress. And I actually want to do this recursively. And now if I do a directory listing with all of them listed, you'll notice that the group associated with WordPress is www-data. Okay, my group still does not have write access, so that's still a problem, but I'm going to give it write access right now. So I'm going to do a sudo chmod, and I'm doing it recursively, 775 for the WordPress directory. Okay, and now if I do a directory listing of all, you'll notice that both the owner and the group can read, write, and execute, and then anyone else that's not part of the owner or group will only be able to read and execute. Okay, so now basically what I've done is I've given my web server write access to that directory, and I can submit this, and hopefully, because I've changed those permissions, it should be able to write that WP config file for me. Okay, still caused problems. Am I using the correct username and password? Yes. Let me look. Username. Oh, sorry, it popped a password back in there. There shouldn't be a password. Still having trouble accessing the database. The reason I think it's having trouble accessing the database, this is a Ubuntu specific thing. The root user account with no password will not connect to MySQL. What ends up happening is I need to create a user account in MySQL that can then write, or I can give the root account a password. So right now, I don't have a password associated with the root account. What happens is, and this is an Ubuntu change, when I connect to MySQL, the only way I can connect to MySQL is kind of indirectly. And what I mean by that is I can use sudo, so run as an administrator. Because I'm an administrator on the machine, I can access MySQL using root, but I'm not actually specifying a password. Okay, so MySQL with root does not mean I have an empty password. I'm getting into MySQL with root because I'm running this command as an administrator on the machine. So sudo saying run that command as an administrator on the machine, and then MySQL is allowing me in. That's a change in Ubuntu. So what I have to do is I have to basically assign a password to. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I've had some trouble with EC2 and creating a password for the root user account. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new account. So I'm going to create this user account as a MySQL user account. So I have to get into MySQL. So I'm going to use sudo mysql-u root. And then I want to create an account. So in order to do that, create user identified by password. So new user and password. And then I have to grant permission to that new user account. So I'm going to grant all privileges on. So I don't have to grant all privileges on everything, but I want this to be an administrative account, so that's fine. Okay. And then I have to flush the privileges. Okay, and now if I exit, I should have a user account called new user with a password of password. So I should be able to come out and say mysql-u new user-p, and then the password will just be password. And now I'm in with that user account. And because I'm able to get into MySQL with that user account, it's a traditional user account with a username and password, I should be able to connect to MySQL in my WordPress setup. So my user account was new user, and my password was password. Okay, so all right, Sparky, you've made it through this part of the installation. WordPress can now communicate with your database. If you're ready to go, I'm going to run the installation. It's asking for a site title. Cloud for developers. My username, I'm just going to make a generic username, so MATC and student. I know it's very weak. I have to confirm that. I'm going to enter my email. So at madisoncollege.edu. And I'm going to install WordPress. Okay, so now I'm going to have Google save my password. I should be able to log in. So I'm using MATC and student. And I'm able to log into WordPress. So I'm in the admin side of things, but I can also go out and visit the site. So here's my WordPress site that's running for Cloud for Developers on my AWS EC2 instance. It looks a little funny because I'm logged in. I have this dashboard where I can come in and customize things, and I have a post, and I have a comment, and I have a page. But you can kind of see what it looks like if I log out. And then I get rid of the WordPress stuff at the end. This is what my end users would see. Okay, so this is my WordPress site. I'm able to customize things. You can see my site title shows up here. I can add new pages. I can add menus. I can create posts. I can create pages. I can comment. So all sorts of things that I can do within WordPress. But really this video is focused on how do I get WordPress installed so I can get started. So that kind of ends this video.